This is a special board meeting, notice of which has been duly provided to board members. First, I'll ask Kate Contino to do a safety briefing.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before we begin, I want to remind everyone that your safety is our first priority and therefore ask you to follow the following procedures. In the event of an emergency, 911 should be called. If an alarm sounds, wait for the public address announcement and follow those instructions. If told to go to another floor or to evacuate the building, leave all unessential items behind and use stairwell A just across the main hallway or stairwell E down the hall past the elevators. In case of an emergency, notify emergency personnel for assistance. An automated external defibrillator for use by trained professionals is in the main hall, just past the elevators. Back to you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Kate. There is no formal board action being taken today. We do have a matter for discussion in executive session. No vote will be taken in an executive session. The public comment portion of today's meeting will take place after management discussion and staff presentations. And do I have a motion to convene an executive session to discuss a confidential matter pursuant to Section 105 of the New York State Public Officers Law? Second, all in favor?
There's discussion period.
Please.
So what's the nature of the confidential discussion? You called this emergency meeting at 4 o'clock on a Friday afternoon. It's 4 o'clock on a Friday to have a discussion about time and attendance. Is it about collective bargaining?
No, sir.
I don't understand. How is it confidential when you've been airing all this stuff out in the media for the last 3-4 days, 2 weeks even?
Yeah, Commissioner Samuelson.
So you air things out just without any discretion whatsoever and then go into executive session when you call a meeting at 4 o'clock on a Friday. How does that make sense?
Commissioner
to all
Samuelson,
the folks that came, to all the folks that are here, how does that make sense?
Commissioner Samuelson, two things. The executive session will, I think, be about 5 minutes. No action will be taken. It does not relate to collective bargaining. And second, I'm going to turn to counsel.
Yes, Commissioner, it is a confidential matter. It falls within Section 105 of the Open Meetings Law. It is a confidential topic. It is not collective bargaining, but that is all I can say because it is by nature confidential.
So I presume when you come out of the confidential session that you're going to get into a discussion about the time and attendance that was on the original agenda?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Good.
I still object to it.
Your objection noted, sir.
Good.
Thank you. And now, may I have a motion to go back into public session? Second. All in favor? All right, we are now back in public session. The board discussed a confidential matter. No vote was taken in executive discussion, and there was no discussion of any collective bargaining agreement. Good afternoon, everyone. We have two priority issues before us today, a discussion on overtime and a rail car issue. I'm going to turn to Commissioner Schwartz, who requested this special meeting, which I called. Larry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, thank you for your quick response to my request for this emergency meeting to discuss recent press reports regarding overtime abuse. I appreciate very much your public comments directing the Inspector General to begin an investigation, as well as other actions you have taken to date. Unfortunately, I don't believe that is enough at this point, and that more actions need to be taken, and they should be taken now. I think I, as a board member, as well as the other members of the board, are seeking answers and explanations. With that in mind, in conjunction with the Inspector General's investigation, I am calling on my fellow board members to join and support me in choosing and hiring an independent outside investigator who is a former prosecutor to investigate and determine why there are constant overtime, payroll, and pension abuses at the MTA. Is it a lack of internal controls? Are existing controls not working? Why has management failed to prevent these constant abuses? I am asking the board to pass a resolution to hire someone at our next board meeting. The goal for me, and hopefully the other board members, is to begin to get some answers and recommendations in the next 30 days. Some may be asking, why am I asking the board to support hiring an outside investigator who is a former prosecutor? It's simple. Since the recent news reports have been coming out regarding new overtime abuses, I have gone back at least 10 years and researched what has taken place. What I have learned is, to say the least, disturbing. Over the past decade, the Metropolitan Transportation Authority's Office of the Inspector General and other oversight entities, such as the New York State Office of the Attorney General and the New York State Office of the State Controller, have issued more than a dozen reports documenting a pattern of time and attendance, pension, and payroll fraud, theft, and abuse spanning the MTA system. Also, during that period, there have been frequent press reports documenting the same problems. These reports have shown a lack of internal control systems, a lack of proper supervisory oversight, and the potential lack of implementing the recommendations in the Inspector General and other oversight reports. These reports clearly show that at a minimum, the MTA needs to immediately put in place a state-of-the-art, system-wide time and attendance system and programs in place, which it appears it currently lacks, as well as other reforms. What I'd like to share with my fellow colleagues on the board is a chronology of these reports on time and attendance that have been published and have been made public over the last 10 years. I'll go quickly, but I think it's important you get a kind of a scope of what's been going on and why I think we're still dealing with some of the same issues or problems today. Back in June 14th of 2009, the New York Post wrote a story that reported that outrageous overtime at the Long Island Railroad led to an investigation by the MTA Inspector General. There were hundreds of instances last year where mechanics worked 24 to 30 hours straight, racking up time and a half and double time pay. The system then dictates that these overtime kings be sent home to collect an additional 8 hours of pay for no work. In December of 2009, the Inspector General published a report regarding investigations into employee misconduct and a lack of supervision at the MTA New York City Transit. And it made a series of recommendations regarding employees conducting personal business on company time. And March of 2010, the Attorney General at that time, Cuomo, obtained an agreement with Long Island Railroad for an independent examiner and other reforms to end disability benefit abuses. In May of 2010, NBC in New York here reported that MTA officials vowed to implement stronger management controls to crack down on rampant overtime and sick time abuse. In June of 2010, the New York Times reported that thousands of MTA employees made $100,000 or more last year. It seems that that is still occurring. The Journal News on November 10th of 2011 reported that Metro-North Railroad construction workers received more than $1 million last year in avoidable overtime and rest shifts, according to a state audit released Wednesday by the Office of State Controller Tom DiNapoli. On January 11th of 2012, again, the New York Post reported that an average MTA worker used 13 paid or unpaid sick days a year, according to the agency. On June 15th of 2012, again, the Post reported, again, another story regarding MTA workers raking in more than $100,000 in overtime. The biggest abuser was a Long Island Railroad train car repairman named Vincent Blackburn, who earned a staggering $135,000. Again, in 2012, in October, there was another Office of Inspector General report that noted several thousands of labor hours and more than 160,000 was wasted through lax supervision. In 2013, there was another Office of Inspector General report. I'm trying to go a little bit faster here. In September 2013, the Office of Inspector General review of Metro-North's onboard services unit found that employees had discrepancies on questionable entries in their work logs. Again, the Daily News in 2013 reported Metro-North workers collecting salaries and overtime while going entire shifts without working. In 2014, there was another Inspector General report regarding abuse of time, falsification of records, and gross lack of productivity by former employees of the Structures Division. On January 27th of 2014, the Journal News had another story about Metro-North and Long Island Railroad failed to properly monitor overtime hours that were paid with funds from the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. In December of 2014, there was another Inspector General report regarding finding and citing numerous examples of inadequate and often non-existent controls over the work activities of the employees. In July of 2015, there was another story in the Daily News regarding MTA employees on the track to get hefty six-figure salaries. In 2016, the Office of Inspector General had another report regarding the Long Island Railroad in reducing the number of lost workdays resulting from job-related injuries. And also the fact that at the MTA bridges and tunnels, employees were not required to disclose their outside employment. And it noted in that investigation that there were individual employees abusing time. And also in 2016, there was another Office of Inspector General report regarding serious deficiencies in signals record-keeping practices that made it possible for accurate and false reporting to go undetected in signals management. In 2017, there was an OIG report regarding abuse of overtime. And I'm just going to mention a couple of other reports, most recent reports. Again, in 2018, in March of last year, the Empire Center reported that overtime spending by the MTA reached a record $1.2 billion, a 20% increase over the 2016 level. In 2018, in August, the Inspector General had another report that there are nearly 4,000 requests for FMLA leave in 2016-17 in the New York City Transit system, but New York City Transit had no controls to deter or even detect abuse of this benefit. So as you can see, in just going back over the last 10 years, there's been a lot of stories and investigations by not only the MTA's Inspector General, but also many, many news reports about the lack of oversight, the lack of controls. And clearly one of my goal is to get, as I mentioned at the beginning, to get answers and come up with solutions, and not play the finger-pointing game or the blame game. But there's a few other things that I want to raise to my fellow board members and seek answers from MTA staff. Clearly, the recent stories that came out about Mr. Caputo, who I know is retired, and another gentleman named Marco Pasmino, I'm sure there are many others, but unfortunately for them, their names were mentioned in the press. I don't think any human being of sound mind and body would ever believe that somebody can work 3,800 hours of overtime in a single year, or 4,157 hours in a single year, in addition to their straight time. If you take out a calculator, for Mr. Caputo, it would be 10.4 hours a day, 365 days a year. And for Mr. Pasmino, it would be 11.4 hours a day of overtime for 365 days a year. I'd like to know whether or not either one of these gentlemen ever took a vacation day in 2018, a sick day, a personal day, because that would just make the issue even more egregious than just pulling out a single calculator, pulling out a calculator and trying to do some kind of math. One of my questions is, what efforts are there going to be, not just with these two gentlemen, but with many other people that are potentially have abused the system or committed fraud or theft? What efforts going back not only to 2018, but 2017, 16, and as far back as the statute of limitations to investigate whether or not people committed fraud or larceny, and what are we going to do to collect those taxpayer funds? I'd also like to get from the staff, and maybe my fellow board members would be interested in getting all this information as well, and I'd like to make sure that a transcript of my remarks are available to the board members that couldn't be today. Take 2018, 2017. How many MTA workers broken down by division earned $300,000 or more in overtime? How many between $200,000 and $300,000 in overtime? How much between $100,000 and $200,000 in overtime? Have we ever looked at the issue or problem of spiking? Have we gone back and looked at employees in their year of retirement? How many hours of overtime did they earn in their final year of retirement and the prior 2 years? Because for many of our employees, it's your final final 3-year average. So what was the number of hours of overtime they earned in their final 3 years versus prior to that? And if the spiking was going on, what did we do or not do to control it? I'd also like to know what the racial and gender breakdown is of our top 100 overtime earners. I want to know what is the monitoring and auditing process when it comes to overtime or other payroll abuses. Who signed off on employees earning thousands of hours of overtime? I completely understand there's many employees that earned it legitimately, whether it was through the Subway Action Plan or some other capital project. But there's also, it appears to be, many employees that scammed or abused the system and potentially stole public funds, not only to enhance their annual salary, but also to enhance their pension benefits. In 2018, Andy Byford was the 21st highest earner at the MTA. Who was the 20 that were above him? And why did it not sound an alarm and question overtime abuses? How many different time and attendance systems are there in the MTA? Does every MTA location have a time and attendance system? Do we use a honor system for time and attendance in any location where supervisors just check logs and it's all done on an honor system? Why do we have more than one time and attendance system in the MTA system? Why don't we have one universal time and attendance system that's state-of-the-art? The other thing I want to raise and seeking questions to, and I may not accurately describe this or get it because I've been doing a lot of homework over the last 72 hours, is another thing that came to my attention that I've probably been aware of, but it didn't register with me or dawn on me, and it doesn't make any sense. So I need an explanation. I think all the board members would need an explanation why this would make sense, because right now it doesn't to me, and I would want to end immediately this process. There's something that's called planned weekend work, that where my understanding is on a lot of our big capital projects like Hudson Yards, East Side Access, bridge replacements, grade crossing projects, we have third-party contractors. They tell us what their needs are for the weekend, and we post work assignment. These planned weekend work assignments are for 55 or 48 hours of straight overtime. I don't know any single human being, including myself, that could work 55 straight hours in a given weekend, let alone 48. If what's been described and explained to me is accurate, and I'm not saying it's totally accurate or it's maybe partially accurate, I don't understand the logic of posting jobs for 55 straight hours or 48 straight hours on a given weekend. It makes no sense. To me, it puts the safety of workers at risk, that individual, but the individual's colleagues. And the only other thing that comes to my mind when I hear something like this is that none of these workers that bid on these weekend work assignments actually work 55 hours, but they're getting paid for 55 or 48 hours. And I think that's wrong. I think that's inappropriate. The post should be for the number of hours that are actually needed. I also have a question regarding, and trying to get an answer is, why doesn't the MTA have a system-wide hours of service system? I believe under federal law, certain job classifications like a bus driver or a train engineer can only work a certain number of hours before they have to take a mandatory rest. Why doesn't that happen for all job classifications, and why does not take place system-wide? Why don't we use an hours of service system for things like overnight outages or weekend planned work? And the last thing I want to raise for my fellow board members is for the leadership of the MTA to explain the whole concept of third-party contracting. Because my concern there, again, is accountability. Contractors, third-party contractors tell the MTA what they need on the weekends or overnight. The MTA signs the jobs, which I've already mentioned. But what kind of time and attendance system did these third-party contractors use? Where is their accountability, whether or not the people that signed up for these jobs are actually working the time that they picked? And if we're paying people for 55 or 48 hours on a weekend, though they're not working 48 or 55 hours, because I don't believe it's physically possible, and I would think it would seriously affect their health as well as the safety of the people working on that job. That means we're inflating the costs of our capital projects, which goes to the fact of our other problems of capital projects not being completed on time and on budget. So, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate, again, you scheduling this meeting. I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to speak as long as I did and to raise all the questions that I've raised here tonight. But I'm really seeking answers from yourself, Ronnie, Andy, Phil, Kathy. I'm sure my other colleagues here on the board have their own set of questions or concerns, and I'm interested in hearing them as well. And thank you, everyone, for your time.
Thank you. Commissioner, I'm going to make a couple of comments, and then I'll make sure you're the first to go. I want to talk about the MTA's financial situation and overtime. The MTA continues to face steep fiscal challenges and a bleak future forecast, with projected operating deficits of nearly $1 billion in 2020-2021. In the next 12 months, we must reduce expenses by $500 million. While the governor and our partners in the state legislature have shown tremendous leadership in passing central business district tolling and 2 additional revenue streams to help fund the next MTA capital program, no new funding for operations has been provided. State law requires that the MTA break even each year. The consequences of not breaking even would be severe. In addition to central business district tolling, this year's state budget required a series of MTA reforms, including a forensic audit and a restructuring and organization plan, which we're actively working on with Alex partners. More about that in a minute. We as the board and senior leadership of a public agency always have a duty to taxpayers and our customers to ensure we are managing effectively and responsibly and efficiently using the public dollars we're entrusted with. As we start today's discussion, I want to first make it clear that any discussion of overtime and any issues that arise are largely a reflection on the MTA, not on the hardworking men and women who keep the region moving every day. It's the MTA's responsibility to manage, monitor, and control overtime. Most overtime hours are legitimate and worked by employees away from their families. There is a small fraction of overtime that is fraudulent and involves abuse of the current system. We are investigating and will take aggressive action to curb this type of overtime and ensure responsible use of taxpayer dollars. On that score, I can report that in the last several months, 5 Long Island Railroad employees have been disciplined or are facing discipline for overtime abuse. The MTA IG has other open investigations at the Long Island Railroad. The MTA network operates 24/7, 365. Our women and men on the front lines work on nights and weekends through blizzards and emergency. Overtime, when authorized and appropriate, is a way for us to keep the system running through severe weather events like Superstorm Sandy. It also, as Commissioner Schwartz mentioned, allows us to accelerate a tremendous amount of maintenance and repair work, delivering a better system for our customers through initiatives such as Subway Action Plan. In the last 15 years, total headcount at the MTA has increased nearly 19% by nearly 12,000 positions, while the scope of our service has remained constant, save for acquisition several years ago of financially challenged bus lines. 3 or 4 issues on overtime. First, safety. Safety is always our top priority, and it's no different when it comes to the issue of overtime. It's management's responsibility to ensure employees are not working so many hours that it becomes unsafe. The federal government has allowed a gap to exist in federal regulations governing certain railroad employees' hours of service, which impose requirements in certain cases for rest periods of maximum hours that can be safely worked. Although the federal code includes train operators, engineers, and signal maintainers, among other employment classes, it does not currently include maintenance of way workers, employees, that install, repair, and maintain track. The FRA has been grappling with this issue for years, and the MTA has repeatedly weighed in with our perspective, and we will continue to do so. I note with sadness that rail workers around the country who are not governed by hours of service rules have been killed and injured due to fatigue. There is a current NTSB, National Transportation Safety Board investigation underway related to an accident at the Long Island Railroad involving a maintenance of way worker fatality that occurred 2 years ago, following an excessive number of hours of work. What do I mean by excessive? The deceased Long Island Railroad foreman had been on duty for 11 hours, with 13 hours remaining on his scheduled tour, and had worked a total of 64.45 hours in the days prior to the tragic incident. And while I cannot speak to causality and do not have any insight into the outcome of the NTSB investigation, I do believe, as I do most of you, that someone who's worked hundreds of hours in a week and has apparently frequently done so should not be driving their personal car home, let alone operating or working around heavy railroad equipment. These extended hours clearly could pose a safety risk to workers, and it's our responsibility as management to ensure that we are providing safe working conditions for our employees. To address this, I intend to consult with the relevant unions at both Long Island Railroad and Metro-North with respect to limits on the hours of maintenance way workers to be in line with other safety critical positions governed by federal hours of service regulation, except in cases of true emergency. Failing agreement on that, I'm prepared to take action unilaterally to limit the number of hours by maintenance of hour workers. Overtime security. Our closer look at timekeeping is also rooted in safety concerns. We must know who is or is not on the premises or at our facilities for the safety and security of our employees and our customers. In recent days, a limited number of civilians and MTA police officers have performed random checks at our facilities. This was intended only to be a temporary measure to address immediate security concerns, ones that will no longer be needed when we move to a 21st century timekeeping system. The MTA Police Department helped stand up this effort, and the Inspector General, at my request, has increased its civilian staffing levels to support the effort after completing a move of its offices to new space this weekend. And the MTA Police Department personnel have been reassigned to other work. We're also going to ensure GPS tracking is enabled in all MTA and agency vehicles to monitor their location, to avoid any potential misuse of MTA property, and to indicate where there may be improper or irresponsible practices, especially when employees are on duty. Overtime equity. The Long Island Railroad collective bargaining agreement and its rules about seniority mandate that those with the most years on the job get the first pick at overtime opportunities. To be clear, the Long Island Railroad's unions did not create that provision unilaterally. It was the product of arm's length collective bargaining. Responsibility for that provision rests on the MTA in part too. As a result, there's a perception, which I fear is real, of institutional racism on the part of the MTA and the collective bargaining agreement, propagated by work rules and contracts that favor employees who have been here longest, who the empirical data show is a less diverse workforce than their more junior colleagues. The MTA is committed to addressing this injustice. I know that each of you in this room, including my fellow board members, are committed to the MTA's core values of diversity and inclusion, and to the MTA's role in creating economic opportunities for the region. We should be looking at the current system and practices and identifying ways to reform and improve. Overtime time and attendance systems. Alex Partners is working with my colleagues at the agencies and with Weil Hibry on a rapid rollout of one timekeeping system across all agencies and new attendance systems with biometrics across the agency. Alex Partners is providing oversight and project management, and Weil will share more details along with the expedited schedule. I've asked each president to review the last 12 months of overtime in the first quarter of 2019 at their agencies and to report back within 60 days. I've also asked the IG to perform a full review of examples of excessive overtime to ensure they were appropriately planned, authorized, and worked. Each of the agency presidents has acknowledged the important work of the Inspector General investigations, plural, and are fully cooperating. As I mentioned earlier, under Phil Eng, the Long Island Railroad has brought charges against a handful of current and retired employees for excessive overtime abuse, resulting in some cases in accelerated retirements. We're also reviewing time and attendance verification systems at each facility and deploying a rapid overhaul of these systems. Lastly, wrapping up, I'd like to provide an update and acknowledge cost-cutting initiatives launched by former Acting Chair Ferrer to enact immediate and urgent cost controls to address the agency's operating deficits. These initiatives have helped us control agency costs and work through the statutory requirement to balance our budget, and we're continuing to implement all of them. First, the agency-wide hiring freeze and the Vacancy Control Committee implemented in December of last year by my colleague to my left, and focused on limiting the hiring of non-represented, non-operating employees. That's important, non-represented and non-operating. The committee, which was then chaired by Chair Ferrer, has allowed limited exceptions, and that continues to be the case today. The first of which was Pete Tomlin, an international signaling expert, who joined New York City Transit earlier this year and who just successfully completed CBTC rollout in the 7 line. Lastly, the initiative focused achieving a 10% reduction on professional, technical, and advisory service contracts, and that effort is well underway. A number of negotiations have concluded, and there are active discussions underway with over 40 vendors representing approximately 200 contracts. We expect to see at least $75 million in savings, we're about halfway there, from this overall effort and continue to negotiate with a focus on that. For vendors who have been given repeated opportunities to cooperate but still have challenges complying with the reduction, we are prepared to terminate those contracts for convenience where it makes sense for the MTA pursuant to the terms of those contracts. And with that, I'll wrap up and open up to Commissioner Tessitore. You were first.
Mr. Chairman, fellow board members, I've been on this board since 2007. I have done my absolute best at being a respectful representation of labor. I've attended meetings and listened and cooperated with this board as our union leadership on Long Island Railroad and Anthony Simon, the general chairman of our organization. We have been team players. Today, I could not even tell you how sickened I am by what we're here for and how it was presented by Mr. Schwartz. You know, we're using words, disturbing, abuses, FMLA fraud, all these accusations. Commissioner, you just called out your entire workforce. What I will give you credit for is you called out your management team too. You didn't hold back. You mentioned pointing fingers. You pointed fingers at every single MTA worker in our system. You just told them, thank you so much for what you do. That's what you just did. We're talking about issues of a few employees that have been targeted, obviously. The chairman has already put together a plan to look into and research things, if I'm correct in saying you were looking into this. We're already sitting down trying to find ways. Why now, at this time, would we call out this entire agency the way we just did? You know, here's what I find really troubling. All year long, I attend committee meetings on the Long Island Railroad, and President Eng puts together a presentation of all the good things that we're doing, ahead of schedule, changing out switches, modernizing our signaling system. We're hardening up the infrastructure. We're getting ready for the winter. Who's doing that? And when are we doing it? And how are we doing it? And who's paying for it? And who doesn't know who's paying for it? Our workforce on the Long Island Railroad is as dedicated as can be. And yeah, you know what? They like to work and they like to make money. And if you beg them to work, they're coming. And they'll work proud within the guidelines that are put forth in front of them. I can't understand how we could sing Kumbaya when we're delivering all these programs and now all of a sudden we're concerned about people's safety and how they're getting home. Commissioner, they beg people to stay overnight. They beg them to stay overnight. They need them there because they're qualified on the various pieces of equipment. Do you think they always want to stay? No. And when they don't want to stay, our workers get ordered to stay. You got to stay. We don't have anyone else. We got to get this done. This is a priority project. They want this. This is important. We all want this. So I'm not sure if Commissioner Schwartz is speaking for this entire board, and I have never, ever have been as excited as I have been at a board meeting in my entire career since 2007. I'm embarrassed for this board. I'm embarrassed right now to be at this table. I want to be out on a right of way doing some work. That's what I want to be doing. And that's what our workforce wants to be doing. You can't call them out the way you just called them out. You can't paint this thing with a broad brush and accuse everybody of things that they have a contractual right for. Chairman, you clearly outlined things in there that needed to be said. You did your homework. I'm just at a loss. I know my brothers in labor are going to have a few things to say as well, but this board has to really be careful about the message that they send to the MTA workforce. Because the message that I'm hearing right now is not an inviting message to make me want to work overnight, weekends, holidays, and keep doing this at a pace when I'm going to be scrutinized for it and accused of things for it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Oh, did I take your spot?
Doesn't,
Well,
doesn't make any what's the matter to me. You know, it's,
I'll be quick because I have a question. Vinny Tessitore, I'm just getting to know him. He's very respectful, and I appreciate some of the things he just said. But prior to that, I think Commissioner Schwartz raised a lot of legitimate questions and a lot of fair questions that I have no idea what the answer is, and I would like to hear from your management team perhaps some of the answers to some of the what I thought were some fair questions that Mr. Schwartz asked. And if that's appropriate, I would say I would request that let's get some of those answers, and then perhaps we could get back into some questions.
yeah, well, if you really want to dig deep and ask these guys what to go over the menu that Larry laid out here, maybe I'll save my comments till after then. I mean, it's easy to throw these charges around, and but the sort of math, there's 6,000 employees at the railroad, at the Long Island Railroad, and I think 5,500 at Metro North, and that's a lot of people. And you go over 10 years, and you bring up, I think I got 11 bullet points here. I don't feel it's necessary to apologize for that, and it's not my job to make sure the people are at work. If you don't want them to work overtime, I got an idea. I know it's unusual. Don't ask them to work overtime.
Exactly.
They'll stay home where they're supposed to be. And then you can look at the very top level of our organization. Look at this crowd here. You have 6 voting members here, right? Maybe 7 out of 17 people. They didn't come. Maybe you should have paid them time and a half. Maybe they would have showed up. 0 times 0 is 0. Yes, that's exactly it. But this is what it is. This is an emergency meeting. So most of this overtime here stuff, especially the double time and the rock around the clock stuff, where you don't want. Many times I stayed 24 hours. It wasn't very much fun. You can't believe how much nasty coffee I drank in my life on the railroad. But, that's what you do. And I wasn't a big overtime hitter. And my guys, we don't have seniority preference overtime. You paint us with such a broad brush like everybody's a thief here. And there's 2 ways to divide up overtime in a union shop. You do it by senior man, senior woman, and senior qualified woman, or you do it by equalize among qualified employees. All of my agreements say equalize among qualified employees. Yet I have many people who fall into the $200,000 range because they have particular skills and they're doing difficult and dangerous jobs. It's fine with me if you hire more people, train people in those jobs, and eliminate some of that overtime. That's not my choice. That's part of your human resource strategy. If you let us define how many employees we're going to have a hell of a lot more heads on these properties. So, and the thing is here, there are rules. The rules cost money. Now I suggest, to the extent you take the rules away, or you eliminate the rules, say the double time rule. You eliminate double time when people work beyond 16 hours. They don't get double time anymore. Fine. That doesn't, you eliminate the double time. Double time's the only time that's punitive. Time and a half is the cheapest hour of the day. That's why you have overtime. But so rules merely dictate how the overtime is going to be distributed. Now you take a non-union shop. You know how they distribute overtime in a non-union shop? It goes to the friends and family of the owner, with special consideration for those guys that help them keep the union out. That's how you distribute overtime in a non-union shop. So these are things we're not, you know, my agreements say equalize among qualified employees. Now, their agreements say senior man works first. You got to understand how difficult that is to get out of, because when all these senior guys were young guys, they didn't get to work. They had to sit and wait, so now they're senior guys. Now, if you go into them now and say, oh, equalize, they say, wait a minute, you want me to equalize now after I sat home for 10 years while you guys worked? It's a very difficult thing to get out of. But how you get out of it? You negotiate it the same way you got into it. This stuff's in the collective bargaining agreements. We didn't come up with this stuff on our own. What this stuff is, especially with the cops, you sent the cops into the shop. In my shop, people punch in and out with biometric, with the fingers. They fingerprint in and fingerprint out. Maybe you thought some people were faking their fingerprints. I have no idea. What's coming next? DNA? You're going to have them give their DNA each time they come in? You know, and the cops, they don't know which guy's supposed to be where. The only people that know that are the foremen and the general managers, who you have just, as Vinny eloquently stated, you've just belittled all those people. Well, who do you think is going to be responsible for implementing all the genius reforms the deans at the Ivy League schools come up with, and the Alex partners and all these people? Who's going to implement those things? These foremen that you just made look like fools? They're going to be the ones that are supposed to help you out? And among my friends that I saw on that list of heavy hitters, a whole lot of them were on the rec crew. And when the rec crew goes out, how do you want to do that? Do you want to do that on, how do you want, you know, this is heavy equipment, it's dangerous work. We've got a specialized set of people that go out and work on it every time there's a wreck. I suggest maybe the train and engine service should keep the trains on the track a little bit more, and maybe you should have a few less tractor trailers driving onto the track in some places. But the rec crew goes out, you pay those guys for it. And you know what? They got regular jobs, because you don't have a wreck every day. So the guy works his regular trick. Now there's a wreck. You don't want him to go out? Don't have him go out. Hours of service, fine. Talk to the federal government. You know what that'll make you do? Make you hire more employees, more dues-paying members for the union, more families with health and welfare coverage. I think it's a great thing, hours of service. I didn't want to speak, really, but, you know, but I got a little, you know, we could go on and on. The rules merely dictate how the overtime is going to be distributed. The way the overtime is generated is in a dozen different ways. Mostly, always, at the end of the day, it's because you guys ask them to work. You've got these drop-dead dates artificially imposed. PTC is great. You know, politicians in Washington, they can write a law, PTC's got to be done by such and such a date. Okay, it's done by such and such a date. How do you get it done by such and such a date? They didn't make any provisions for that. It's something that's never been done before. So that has caused a lot of overtime. You have to train people to do a lot of this, you send people to training to do the PTC. You show us a chart every month that shows how the PTC, everybody's getting trained. Do you think that comes out of nowhere? Long Island Railroad, main line, third track. What's the other one, a second track? Double track. Double track. Very important for the development of Long Island, very development for the ridership, critical operations. Well, you know what? You got drop-dead dates on that. You're trying to get it done in a certain period of time. So you really had to have hired up. Part of the problem with that, main line, third track, the idiots along the right-of-way killed the project for about 10 years and stalled it. It should have been done back when Larry's list of, back in 2010 or 2011, it should have been, that's when you should have been working on it. Now you got to rush, put everybody together, get them out there and do it. You can't hire up new people that quick. You can't get them trained. It takes time to make these are particular skills. People don't come from the outside able to do this work. It goes on and on, really.
So can I just ask a question? Andy, Phil, do you guys review overtime in your agencies?
We have a management meeting every month in transit, and one of the criteria we look at is finance. Yes, we do. And also that goes to the transit committee once a month and then on to the finance committee, so it's subject to review, yes.
And if you see any egregious overtime, excessive hours, how do you handle that?
Well, I think what this has demonstrated is we do need to have more granular detail on that. I'm not going to say that we shouldn't. When we get to the detailed questions, one thing that has become apparent to me is we have 3 systems in New York City Transit. I'd say Kronos is pretty good, but the other 2 have flaws. So I certainly welcome having one unified system such that we could more easily get a flag if someone has worked either excessive overtime or excessive safety critical hours.
So from a Long Island Railroad perspective, our management team, when we look at the whole year's work plan, we schedule work accordingly, we schedule outages accordingly to support the work, and then the budget that goes along with that work is part of it. The overtime that's associated with it is reviewed. Our finance group manages and reviews those overtime reports quarterly with each department, and they go through and they monitor in terms of excesses and where we're on budget.
And how do you handle excessive hours of overtime?
Well, we review to see what caused the excesses. If it was an event, if it was a delay in the project, those are the things that we're working to hold those schedules on time. The idea is that we don't want projects to be late. We're working hard to hold schedules, and management will work with the different departments to review those processes and again, try to make sure that we stay within the budget.
Thank you.
Thank you. I guess I'm sitting here on a Friday afternoon, not for my health, but because it's an important topic. Raymond Carver's a writer I liked, and he had a book called What We Talk About When We Talk About Love. I think this is I've retitled this meeting, What We Talk About When We Talk About Overtime. We're not talking about overtime, although we are. What we are talking about is the financial situation of the MTA. So I'll just read a couple of things, because I do think it's important to have this conversation. It's not the first time we're having it. I do believe in the value of organized labor, and Vinny, you moved me. You said some very strong things, and you're right. I've known you for the 5 years, and you've always been a very even-keeled and very much a listening person, so I take to heart how sincerely you feel what you said. And I do believe in the value of collective bargaining, what's it done for the middle class in this country, about career paths and healthy retirements. And you guys do work in tough conditions, there's no question about that. You bring your A game, and we appreciate that. We see it every day, and the writers I represent need you to get to work. But as a businessman and as a taxpayer, I think we got 3 issues. One, we have a real financial crisis. I've said before, we raise fares less than 2% every year, call it 3.5% every 2 years, but wages go up 3.4% every year. And that's total. That's quantity times price. That's wage rates times the number of people we have. So labor is outstripping fares by 1.4%. What's that worth? That's $180 million a year. The day we wake up at January 1st, we're already $180 million behind ourselves. Bob has told us many times we're at $1 billion bogey sitting in 2022, $1 billion deficit, which we have no plan to fix except the cost savings that we're told every year we don't know where they're coming from. That's a real problem. That's a math problem. Secondly, we have a fairness problem. In the old days, you went to the private sector supposedly to make higher wages with more risk. And you went to the public sector, teacher, other jobs, because you had lower wages but more stability. That is not the case anymore. Real wages have barely moved in 40 years. Economy, the recovery is anemic, and yet we have a conversation that Thomas Caputo and others have brought to the fore. Caputo will retire with a $162,000 paycheck for life. There are 7 4-star generals in the United States Army at any one time. A 4-star general after 40 years of service makes $144,000 a year. An E9, by the way, there's only 2 board members here who are military veterans as far as I know, so I speak with some experience with this. An E9, most senior enlisted man, a sergeant major in the Army, spends 40 years in. What does he get for life? $67,000, $100,000 less than Thomas Caputo. You know how much overtime he got? Not 1 stinking cent. Why? Because they don't pay overtime in the Army. So there's a real imbalance. To earn $160,000 a year as a retirement check, you got to have $3 to $4 million in the bank. What percentage of Americans have that in the bank? Less than 1%. It's a really difficult number. So I do think we have an impending fairness problem. And I won't belabor the trust problem. When I was starting to commute here in New York, that was when the Times covered the most famous number I've ever heard. 97% of the employees retire 100% disabled on Long Island Railroad. I know we've solved that problem since, but a scary set of numbers back then. I hope we've solved that. I know we will address these particular issues, but these are numbers that are nerve-wracking to the riders and certainly the press. I know management and labor will work together to address these issues. We've worked collaboratively on many issues. I will continue to urge this board to cap wage increases tied to the fare increase. I believe that's a fair approach. I believe that's a justifiable approach, and I believe we need to continue to do that for a sustainable MTA.
Yeah, so I want to respond to a couple of things, not necessarily the last speaker, although I appreciate some of the things you said, but comparing the Army to New York City transit workers or railroad workers is a little bit like apples and oranges. Not that I want to, go down that path with you. I want to comment certainly on some of the things that have been said here. First of all, like a reality check, you talk about the potential institutional racism with the doling out of overtime. You're not talking about New York City Transit, though. You're talking about the railroads, I assume. But with that said, you know what institutional racism is? This is institutional racism, having the political insensitivity to send armed police into our workplaces. And I don't understand how everybody here and every part of this management group is not utterly embarrassed at the fact that you're acknowledging that your management is so dysfunctional and so messed up that you got to send the cops in. You should all be so totally embarrassed. I think the writing public recognizes that. I think the media recognizes that, and it's true. So if you're going to talk about institutional racism, I think you need to look in the mirror. That's the first thing. The second thing is I appreciate the report by Larry Schwartz, the cherry-picked information that he put forth to the board. I appreciate that, but really what he did, it could be encapsulated by saying that he just described a decade of gross, total mismanagement by the MTA and a decade of indifference, mismanagement, incompetence by the MTA board, of which many people here are part of. And I just heard something very enlightening, that there's an overtime report every single month that comes to not only the presidents of the individual agencies and their management teams, but to the finance committee. So the very thing that Larry Schwartz is pointing out about overtime abuse, he's looking at every single month. So where you been for 4 years? What have you been doing? Except going on the news yesterday and making extremely irresponsible allegations about fraud and about crime and criminality without absolutely no evidence to back that up whatsoever. You're talking about stuff that happened 10 years ago. That's how you started this conversation. You were on the news yesterday talking about fraud and pension abuse. Give everybody in this room, including the media, an example of fraud or pension abuse that you're aware of. And I guarantee you it's zip zilch, because this is all high theater, it's all nonsense, it's all not much ado about nothing. And by the way, every one of us here that's from the union movement that represents members, we're all for an honest day's pay for an honest day's work. But, there's a great irony, and I'll say it again, a great irony at play here. On the subway side of the house, on the New York City Transit side of the house, the system fell into a complete and total state of disrepair. That 2 years ago. That's what happened because you were understaffed and you didn't have headcount. So you adopted a broad program to restore reliability into the New York City subway system. And by the way, the TW played a large role in what that looked like. Right? The company, not the TW, determined that 2,000 heads had to be hired to get the system back into a state of reliability. You hired about 700 or 800 transit workers. You were supposed to hire 2,000. When you want to increase service delivery and you want to increase the state of good repair on the track and you need 2,000 bodies and you don't hire them, you know what you do? You pay overtime. You pay overtime. That's how you get it into shape. So is it a shock to anybody in the room that overtime is being paid out at a higher percentage in 2018 during the subway action plan than it was previously? I'm surprised it didn't spike 50%. It's amazing, and it's a sheer and utter disregard for your own workforce on so many levels. I would be shocked if this doesn't organically resonate across the subway tracks, the bus system, the railroad tracks, and a dip in productivity to add to all the problems of incompetence and mismanagement that you're already suffering. It's buyer's remorse on your part. If you don't want to pay out the overtime, hire enough staff to maintain the system in a state of good repair. If you want to pay overtime rather than hiring another 1,300 transit workers and absorbing the pension costs and the health benefit costs, if your management scheme to avoid that is to pay out overtime to avoid those broader costs, then don't have buyer's remorse and don't run to the media crying about fraud, non-existent fraud, non-provable fraud, totally inaccurate allegations that only succeed in pumping air into a balloon that's already about to pop. That's how irresponsible it is. This is your choice. These are all management choices. If you don't want us to work overtime, don't assign us overtime. It's a pretty simple equation. Norman said it. If you don't want us to work overtime, don't assign it, and see how quick the system falls into a state of disrepair. So I think it's time for you to tell the truth, Pat, for Larry Schwartz to tell the truth. The media's in the room. Everybody is in the room. You're assigning this overtime. Is there an allegation that somehow union-represented workers at the MTA have made their own overtime, conjured up their own overtime, given themselves overtime assignments? It all comes from the bosses. This is not us. We receive overtime as assigned by the company. If you don't want to give us overtime, don't give it to us. But when you give us the overtime, stop the hyperbole, stop the high theater, stop the nonsense, and come to the bargaining table and bargain with us. If anybody thinks for a moment that when Larry Schwartz goes on CBS News and talks about gross fraud and abuse, that we're quaking in our boots, we're not quaking in our boots. We've rode this storm out before. This is a management problem. Fix your management problem. And by the way, a biometric system, that's an interesting concept. How is that going to stop the overtime? How is a biometric system going to stop the overtime? You're going to spend $5,000 or $6,000 a pop on a biometric system. And by the way, do you realize how many reporting locations there are in the New York City subway system? You probably don't, but it's in the neighborhood of 1,500. So you're going to buy 1,500 biometric devices, maintain those biometric devices, and then I'm feeling very prophetic right now. We're going to get overtime to maintain the biometric devices in a state of good repair, and then you're going to come back to this board and you're going to say there's something fraudulent going on with the maintenance of the biometric devices. Because we've seen this movie before. We've seen this movie cyclically, repeatedly, and you know what? I said cyclically, but it's actually sickening. That's what it is. You need to look inward. You need to get your own management team together. You need to somehow infuse some competence into this MTA, and you need to stop blaming your workers. And for anybody who's watching this, anybody who's watching me say this, I'll tell you this. Any transit worker, any railroad worker that does a lick more than they have to do for you after you send armed cops into our workplaces is crazy. You burn bridges with them for the rest of the time you're going to be here. Armed cops. You turned our workplaces into a modern-day chain gang, into Rikers Island. And eventually you're going to pay the price for it in terms of worker morale. So I hope you're happy with what you did. And Larry, I hope you're happy with what you did, ranting and raving about fraud and abuse on CBS News. It was outrageously irresponsible. And you know what? I think I'm going to talk to some of these media folks out here. And you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to start talking about specific examples of management incompetence, management abuse. You know what he should have sent the cops? They should have sent them to 2 Broadway, because this place is rife with fraud and corruption. They shouldn't have sent them into our workplaces. So congratulations, Pat. Way to get started as the MTA chair. Send the cops into our workplaces for a fictitious, big freaking nothing burger. That's what that amounts to. Congratulations.
Tough to follow on that. I'm new to this in more ways than one, but I know a little bit about overtime. I just to set this table, because I'm eager to hear from this side of the table, I don't think anybody here begrudges overtime. I think the concern is about abuse. And I think the issue around that is it's incumbent, and I think there you got a point, on the MTA and MTA management to put the proper controls and oversight in so that the abuse isn't there, whatever the abuse is. And I'm not pointing a finger as to know what that abuse is. I don't know what the abuse is. I don't know. Well, once we have an understanding of whether or not we have the proper controls and oversights in place, and that's what we're going to hear from, then we'll understand whether the controls are there.
Yeah, but Larry was on TV last night saying that there was fraud and abuse, rampant fraud and abuse. And now he's actually put forth to hire yet another consultant. What is that, like the 470th consultant that you're hiring? Well, you have an inspector general sitting right behind me right here. Why doesn't he do a comprehensive investigation into allegations of fraud and abuse?
John,
You're outsourcing that work
John,
too.
the Inspector General is going to be doing one, number one. Number two is I've recommended that the board have its own independent investigation. I don't recall using the word rampant. I said there's a fraud and abuse, and we need to identify where it is, why it is. I put most of this blame on management. I agree with that. There's not one universal time and attendance system. There's a lot of places that are using punch cards, from what I'm understanding, and some places that use biometrics. I don't understand why we have all kinds of different systems for time and attendance. And, well, we can agree to disagree because, quite frankly, it was never my intention, I tried to say this up front, to besmirch, the majority of good, hard-working,
Well, you
rank
did
and
it.
file.
You
Well,
did
okay,
it.
so
Congratulations.
fine, we'll agree to disagree whether or not.
After you've seen the reports
John, can I
every
finish?
single freaking month, you see the overtime reports.
I don't see the overtime.
And what'd you do about it?
John,
You know
I don't.
what? That makes you
John,
incompetent.
John,
You're the ones who
John,
viewed them.
I don't see overtime. I see a gross number. I don't see an overtime report of some employee having put in 3,000 hours of overtime. And I got to question it because I don't think you physically can work that many hours of overtime a year.
He was assigned that overtime by you, by this company.
Shame on the management then, John.
If you find shame on management, shame on management. Our guy was assigned the overtime.
That's why I want an investigation to get to the bottom
So
of it.
investigate the bosses. Don't go on to television and make
John, I'm
wild
happy to
accusations about
investigate everybody.
criminality
I'm happy
of
to
your
investigate
workers.
everybody.
Yes. We've heard an awful lot here today, obviously, from every side of the equation, and I'm wondering, is there a formula by which normal overtime that has been requested by management, overtime that is necessary for all the night and weekend jobs that are taking place in the system, becomes abuse of overtime? Is there a formula by which you can look at something and say, this is normal, this is because this project had an emergency, this is abuse? Is there a formula?
The answer is it depends. Projects like Subway Action Plan, which has been incredibly important to the improvement in subway service, along with the work that Andy Byford and Sally Librera has done, caused overtime. Andy Byford's going to report that, or Bob Ferran's going to report it later today. Capital projects at the Long Island Railroad and New York City Transit or Metro North lead to overtime. As Larry Schwartz just said, and as Commissioner Samuelson said, I agree with him, overtime is assigned by management. Union members don't take their own overtime. Commissioner Samuelson's right. So it all depends. Part of the issue here is one, abuse. As I said in my comments, abuse is infrequent but does happen. Obviously, we're fiduciaries and we have a responsibility to be careful with every dollar that we spend, point one. Point two, the organization's credibility and reputation is impaired when outrageous things happen. There are provisions of union contracts, which I noted in my comments, were not usurped by union members. They were negotiated at arm's length basis between the MTA and particular unions. That didn't happen unilaterally. And we've got to do a better job of having timekeeping and attendance systems in place that are 21st century and not 19th century. Norman.
Yeah, I think there's, that Andrew's really on to what's really bothering me here is this is a have you stop beating your wife issue. And I came into this meeting wanting, as I always do, wanting to keep my mouth shut. But it really, this is the sort of a Trumpian discourse in that your ability to counteract the genuinely stupid allegations, just amplify them. And to call something abuse, you need some sort of working definition for what you mean. You obviously mean Mr. Caputo was abusive. Egregious is another one. But when you assign police, this is an assumption of guilt. And this is the thing, it's just one of my favorite philosophers has a concept called cultural hegemony. This is cultural hegemony. You've shown that you need police to stand by the time clocks on the railroad. Now, on the railroad, you have these stories for years and years, and I mean, when I started on the railroad, they had stories of the 1954 wreck in Richmond Hill. I mean, you know, these stories live on and on and on in the consciousness of workers. And now, for the rest of eternity, they're going to be thinking on the railroad, oh, they had to send, remember when they had to send cops to, you better watch out, these guys will send, it's an entirely ass-backwards way to approach the relationship, which us three here, we thrive on relationships. We want to have conversations with people. I haven't had a single conversation on this until today. Did they talk to you? Did anybody talk to you, Vinny?
About the cops coming?
No,
that
nobody
was a
talked to me.
blindside.
Oh, my members are calling me. Hey, they got the cops over here. What am I supposed to tell them? I didn't know nothing. If I had a little back and forth, and I could tell you what I really think, but this is a have you stop beating your wife issue. We are already guilty. It's not due process. And one thing about due process, as you find people, you went over 10 years there, some people do game the system. They get caught. Ideally, the IG catches them. But just because the newspaper calls it abuse, I don't care what great newspaper it is. A great newspaper like the New York Post. Ooh, come on. If it's a serious thing, let's talk about it in a serious way and not have an execution in the media.
Just a quick follow-up to ask two things at this point. What's going to be our plan to hire, particularly in the on the Long Island Railroad, in the engineering side? What is the plan to hire track workers so that we don't have to read about them again next year? It's just that simple. Because from last time I checked, we still got a lot of work to do, right? And the second thing, what are we going to do to try to win back our employees? Because they already know what's going on, and after this meeting today, they are going to be fired up. And quite honestly, they're going to love us. They're going to love us because we had enough, right? But we're responsible people. Labor is responsible throughout the MTA, and we're always going to work towards fixing problems, and we probably started already. But we have to let our employees know how valuable they are to us. We have to. We have to.
If I could just, in response to what Andrew said, just 3 seconds so that everybody in the room is aware. There's a complaint about overtime. There's a complaint about the overtime growing. People in the room should be aware that the MTA came to the TW and asked the TW to lift the overtime caps in our contracts last year. We have overtime caps in place that prevent New York City transit workers from working a ton of overtime, right? We have plans in place. The company needed work done so much, to such an extent, to restore reliability into the system, that they came to us and bargained to remove the caps. So we say, okay, we have to get work done. We have to restore the system into reliability. We agree to remove the overtime caps, and then we read about ourselves in the paper as abusive and fraudulent after you asked us to remove the overtime caps. That's outrageous. Do you realize how outrageous that is? You probably didn't even know that, Pat.
Michael, you said you're not a stranger to overtime issues. Neither am I. I run an agency that has a lot of overtime. We too have been in the papers from time to time, as most city agencies have. And I appreciate very much what my colleagues here are saying. We make use of it in the city government as well when we have crucial projects that need to get done, as the Subway Action Plan does. And I agree that obviously it's often management and labor together who need to figure out if something's going wrong. I don't know whether anything is here or not. That's, I think, for you all to decide. I just have to say, with all due respect, I'm kind of with you. I don't know that we need another consultant in the mix. We have a hell of a lot of them now. I think the two sides should get together. You have an incredibly good management team here. You've got, passionate labor leaders. I think to the extent that there are problems to be fixed or procedures to be fixed, I look around this room and I see a group of people, and that includes you, Pat, who I think could get it done. I don't know that bringing in yet another consultant is needed here. It obviously feels like we need to have a conversation about it, but I trust the team on both sides can make any fixes that need to be fixed, as we often do in the city when we land in the papers on some of these issues.
Sure. If we can flip the screen up, the presentation. Let me first just start. We have a report that is prepared at each of the agencies and is also prepared on a consolidated basis at the for headquarters, and it goes through overtime by month, and it has categories of overtime, non-reimbursable, and you're going to see that term later on. That just means it hits the operating budget. And then we have reimbursable overtime, and that's overtime which is incurred to support projects that are going to be reimbursed from the capital program, so it doesn't hit the operating budget. But within the non-reimbursable, we look at different categories. There is scheduled overtime. We know we're going to have that overtime, and it's built into the budget. There's unscheduled service, where some extraordinary event comes along, and we're going to do what needs to be done to deliver the service. We have programmatic and routine maintenance that's done. It's best done by using overtime. So again, that's built into the budget. We plan on that. There's unscheduled maintenance where something extraordinary happens and we need to do whatever is done to make sure that the service is there. We have overtime that we incur because there's a vacancy. We don't have a position filled and somebody needs to do that job, or we have absentees. So that's the reason for overtime. Weather emergencies, clearly, you got to do whatever's necessary to be prepared and then to take action. Safety, security, law enforcement are reasons for overtime. So there's good overtime, and then there's overtime that perhaps you don't need to incur, and that's something to be questioned. But that's the type of report that we look at. So what I'd like to flip for the next chart is just to look over the last 2 full calendar years and year to date, March. The orange is what was in the February plan. That's the adopted budget. And then the blue is the actual overtime that was incurred, both for non-reimbursable and for reimbursable. So dollars go into the operating budget and dollars that hit the capital budget. You can see in 2017, we had $1.2 billion of overtime versus budgeted of $925. Now, we had higher overtime, but if you looked at the straight payroll, payroll was lower. We had $77 million of favorable payroll because we didn't have employees on the books, and then $277 of overtime. So the net there is about $199. You go to 2018, the difference in an unfavorable variance of $396. Well, in that year, just the straight payroll was down about $116 million because we didn't have the full-time employees there. So the net was about $281. And then this year, year to date, about a $67 million variance, but the straight payroll was down about $33 million. So basically, it's a $33 million net variance. If you look year by year, and you can see what are some of the reasons for these variances, it's pretty clear how the money is getting spent. So go to 2017, the next chart, and you can see on the non-reimbursable side, it's about $181 million of a variance, unfavorable variance. New York City Transit was responsible for about $149 million of it, but the Subway Action Plan contributed $46 million of that negative variance. And if you take into account the work that was done on tracks and maintenance beginning in March when the emergency order came out, that's another $45 million. Then we had absentee vacancy coverage of $33 million, subway service delays and bus traffic congestion, which meant that we had to have the routes longer, people were on the job longer, $21 million, and then weather about $5 million. So all reasonable reasons for the overtime increase. Smaller on headquarters, Long Island Railroad, MTA bus. You get down to the reimbursable on the bottom. Again, New York City Transit responsible for about $76 million, which of course, they're the majority of all of our expenditures. But it was really a lot for the Subway Action Plan type work. Remember, the Subway Action Plan started in the summer. You go to 2018, a $396 million overage. New York City Transit, about $219. 105, almost half of that was the Subway Action Plan. Subway delays, bus traffic congestion, meaning longer routes, people were on the job longer, $52 million. Vacancy absentee coverage, $19 million. Long Island Railroad, $25 million, and that basically is vacancies and lower employee availability. Reimbursable, about $124 million. Again, much for the Subway Action Plan. Year-to-date 2019, $67 million. Again, that's the gross number. But what does it do? New York City, $34 million. $22 million of that is the Subway Action Plan. Vacancy absentee coverage, $7 million. So as you go through here, you see that this is 1 year where non-reimbursable at $36 million versus reimbursable at $31 million. It's almost 50-50. And if you think about the acceleration that we've been doing in our capital program, we're trying to get the work done faster, sooner, quicker. So of course, to get that done, we're going to have to rely upon more overtime. So that's why the balance has changed. But I think as you can see, there's overtime that we really do need. We have to have it. It makes us more efficient. And then there's overtime that you just can never prepare for when the unexpected happens. But you need to go through and look to see why we have overtime variances. And with that, I'll turn it back to you.
Pat, listen, I asked for this emergency meeting. I understand there's a need for overtime. I've been in government for 35 plus years. I understand the whole issue of overtime and the need for overtime, whether it's for emergency, storm-related, for capital projects, the Subway Action Plan, which I was involved in, and on and on and on. I asked you to call this emergency meeting because of the point that seems that have gotten lost, and I'll take responsibility for it, is that I believe there's a lack of internal controls. There is no time and attendance system that anybody on staff has told me exists in every location in the MTA system, and it's the same location. I have no idea if there are locations where there's nothing, zero. It's an honor system, or it's a punch card system, which to me went out in the 70s. And why isn't there biometric? And the fact that there seems to be no red flag system where if somebody put in for 4,000 hours, someone says, woo, wow, how could there be 4,000 hours? So to me, this issue and the answers that I didn't get today and the answers that I'm going to demand and expect very shortly is all the questions I asked about a lack of controls, a lack of supervisory management. Where are they? When are they going to be in place? I get that we have a budget for overtime. The budget for overtime has been going up and up and up and up. And as a result of a lack of controls, it creates opportunity for fraud and abuse. And it's bad enough that the ridership lacks trust and confidence in the MTA, which I'm trying to help turn it around. But when they read stories about the lack of controls and other problems, it makes our job 10 times harder to convince the public that things are getting better and things will get better. And, I hold, your team accountable to provide me with the answers as to why this has been going on and, to me, why they haven't really aggressively addressed it till now. Thank you.
The next two sets of presentations are by the agency presidents on their specific agencies, and then a present.
I want to have a comment on what Bob Ferran said. Bob Ferran gave a beautiful presentation, explained the overtime assignments absolutely perfectly. He actually supported what all three union reps at this table said, and he totally contradicted the opening statements made by Larry Schwartz that there's some sort of abuse and fraud going on with the overtime. And I see that Larry quickly evolved into potential fraud and abuse, but that's not what he was saying on TV yesterday. And for a guy that says he's trying to make it better, you're sure throwing freaking Molotov cocktails right into the middle of all of this by going on TV and baselessly and irresponsibly saying that there's fraud and abuse and you demand an investigation. And by the way, Larry, I don't know how much time you spent in subway workplaces or bus workplaces, but I would wager that it's not very many. There's a reporting and clearing system in every single facility that New York City Transit has. Every single one. There's a time and attendance system in play. So you're insulting all of these bosses at the table back here, as well as the workforce of the MTA, by acting as if they're in the Stone Age or something. They're not in the Stone Age. There's time and attendance and reporting and clearance systems in place all over the system. So everybody at that table would be able to, would agree with me. It might not be a uniform system, but that ain't our problem.
Yeah, it's not only Bob's words, but his numbers will support our position. Could you go back to that slide that shows all 3 years? The first there, the one with the tree. Yeah. All right. So, 2017, the difference between them two charts. I mean, it's one thing you learn primitive mathematics in a machine shop. So, you know, numbers are sticky things. So. Go back to 2017, and the difference between those two numbers was 30%. You go to 2018, the difference was 40%. Well, you go to the first quarter this year, and the difference is 25%. So you actually are getting better. In addition, when you extrapolate that number, the top number, the 326 number, by 4, and it's not really a very accurate way to do it because we had a lot of winter overtime. I mean, this includes the winter. So it's probably going to go down more than that. But if you extrapolate it out, it comes to 1,304 total, which again is 80 million less than last year. Maybe that's too much. Fine, granted. Don't ask the guys to work overtime. They won't work the overtime.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, board members. I do appreciate the opportunity to talk about the Long Island Railroad. One of the things that I've talked a lot about is how critical the railroad is to the region's economy. I've talked a lot about the growing ridership that we have, and we've talked a lot about the unprecedented amount of capital construction that we're going on, and the need to restore reliability to the service. And that's been a focus of ours from day one since I've started. That we are working hard to meet those commitments to the public, and to make sure that we can actually build the railroad to meet the demands not only for today but for the future. And I'm proud to say that we are seeing benefits from all of the efforts that are ongoing. And one of the challenges that we have is that as a 24/7 system providing service to our customers, what we look to do when we do capital work, when we look to do maintenance, a lot of that work, in order to be to find the time to be most productive, is in the evening hours or weekend hours when we have more opportunity to either have outages or greater headway, and that is premium time. But that is one of the things that we are managing in terms of how to ensure we can continue to provide the level of service that we need for our customers, get the work done, as well as provide a safe work environment for our employees. As I said earlier, I am pleased to see that the on-time performance has been improving, and we continue to work towards that, and the capital projects that we're looking to progress to be able to continue to meet the growing needs of Long Island. Having said that, I do know that it is my responsibility as president of the railroad to make sure that as we review our capital program, as we review the needs for developing work, and as we plan that work, and then as we manage and review time and attendance, it is my responsibility to make sure that I give both the managers and the employees the right direction. I give them the tools and the resources to do the things that we need to do. And as such, with that, what I'm looking at right now, as you asked for, Chairman, is that we review our past practices, our past procedures, and look at our overtime and time and attendance type recording methods. It is a full spectrum of different things to the different trades. We do have systems where it is on paper and the employee fills out the forms, the supervisors review it, and administratively they get entered into the system. And then we go all the way through phone in and phone out with regards to tracking that, and then to the biometrics with the fingerprinting. So we have a varied methods, and one of my responsibilities, and I'm going to sit down with my management team as we're looking at this now, is to how be better consistent across all of the trades to make sure, again, that we have a system in place that allows our managers to manage better and allow employees to have clear direction from us. And I think with that, the other part is, and I think Bob alluded to some of it, when we took a look at the overtime, So for the first 3 months of 2019, probably a little bit more than 50% of that overtime is attributed to capital program work. A little bit less than 50% is tied to operations, and then the remainder is weather events. So we are looking at that. A lot of the other types of things that we are focused on is the capital program, supporting third track, supporting East Side Access, getting our fleet up and running, doing a lot of maintenance, track inspection, and it's about, again, it's my responsibility to make sure that I give the tools, the resources, and the clear direction. I take full responsibility for that, and we're going to continue to work through as we review current practices and how do we make sure that we adopt the best practices for everybody, including working with headquarters with regards to looking at the state-of-the-art technology for tracking time and attendance.
Any questions for Phil? Kevin?
Yes, thanks, Pat. I've heard a lot of good points, a lot of, from all the members. I still think Larry raised a lot of important issues, a lot of important questions. People may not agree the way he delivered them or said them, but I thought he was pretty clear here today with some of the questions that he raised. But I also think that and I know I'm new here, but I wasn't put on the board to be shy, and so I don't have a problem speaking up. The average commuter or the average fare rider, they're also taxpayers. And I know I got calls last week from somebody on Long Island who makes a decent salary, but nowhere near what was reported in the press lately about the gentleman who earned all the money in overtime. In fact, they don't even have in their 401k what was earned in overtime. And they question, how can this be? And we get involved in billions of dollars and maybe complicated labor agreements that I still need to learn about from my brothers here from the labor. But I think they're legitimate questions because I had no idea how to answer the question, and they're not alone. And so these are legitimate issues, and I don't know, Phil, is this a matter of management being asleep at the switch, or do we have some bad apples sleeping on the job? Because it's not. We know the great men and women who work for us, the great majority of them bust their tail every day. And like in every organization, there's a few bad apples. And so what is it? Is this a management issue, and what are we doing about it? Or there's some bad apples?
Well, Commissioner Law, what we're looking at is right now is the processes in which we plan work. As I said earlier, one of the challenges we have is to make sure that when we do the work, we're minimizing impacts to the riding public. As with running service 24/7, a lot of the work that does get done in order to be most productive is during the evening and the weekend hours. That is overtime, and that's one of the things that we're reviewing. Can we find other ways to do this work in the daytime? That would limit some of the overtime, but at the same time, we want to make sure that we don't impact the service that we need to provide, and that we can make sure that people can get to their destinations. With regards to the management tools, that's something that I am looking at because I don't want the managers to have this the inability to review properly, to plan properly, and then at the same time, I need to make sure that our employees have the proper direction in terms of the schedules, when it needs to be done, but also that they have the right tools to be able to do it in the time frame that we've asked. The other goal that we're looking to do is to hold our projects on time, because we know when projects are delayed, that adds cost as well. So those are the things that we're balancing, and what I'm working with is the managers to take a look at past practices, see where perhaps we need to improve, and then make sure that I give them those tools.
So one thing I would observe, because that was very helpful, that slide that Bob put up about overtime. If we're increasing overtime 30 to 40% in a year, that suggests there's a lot more money flowing into the system, which suggests that we should probably have another look at the controls, because every time you put that much more in, And it's going to keep going. And by the way, the vast majority of it, I'm sure, is justified. You just want to make sure that it's being money well spent.
Yeah, I just don't see how you can look at those numbers and not conclude you need to hire more people. I mean, at the end of the day, you need to hire more people, and that's it's, you know, a rising tide lifts all boats. That's what you really have to do to bring these numbers down in the long run. How the overtime is going to be 3 years from now, and we didn't even discuss, and this is a complex, what do you call it, human resource management issue. We didn't even discuss the stuff on the property I represent on Metro North. The retirement bubble they're facing is enormous, and partly because of the hiring freeze, doesn't affect the represented employees supposedly. However, you can't get anybody, you'd have to be a fool to take a promotion to management. So who do you get to manage these people? People that don't know how to do the jobs that the people they're managing. And it, you know, this is stuff, there's no way to look at this and get out of it without hiring people. Now, back to a point I failed to make before, that, you know, one of my favorite holidays is Passover, even though I'm an atheist. I mean, I like escape from slavery stories. You know, but my favorite line though, and I wait for every Passover to get to the punchline, which is, why is tonight different than all other nights? And that's my question here: is why are we discussing this now? And I proffer a answer why the good government groups, the watchdogs, the New York Post, the Empire Center, why they're all after these numbers right now and why they're insulting the workers right now is because contract negotiations have just begun. I'm shocked to find there's a parallel between the two. Well, let's try to settle these things at the bargaining table. There's no other way to get out of the rules-based. If we were to violate those rules, the member would have a right to sue the union. It's not something we have an option to do. So the only way out of it is in negotiations. And these guys are very competent bargainers. You'll put competent people there. You'll sit down, you'll disagree, you'll go back and forth. But that's how some of these rules got to be, is in former negotiations. So that falls under the be careful what you wish for, it might come true rule.
Kathy.
Thank you. I'm going to divide my remarks into a couple of different categories. First, I want to talk a little bit about the overtime drivers, then some of the overtime trends, and then just a little bit about our timekeeping system. But before I do all of that, I do want to express my thanks to the Metro North workforce, who have been there for me since I've been president. They're there every day. I've been in the Situation Room at 3 o'clock in the morning waiting for the railroad to come back, and it's the workers who are out there in all kinds of weather who get the railroad back. So I do want to express my appreciation to those people who do that every single day. In terms of the overtime drivers, it does overlap with quite a bit of what Phil said. So we have a significant state of good repair backlog, but that's compounded by the need to do the work nights and weekends in order not to interfere with service. This reflects our renewed commitment to the infrastructure renewal that occurred after all of the events of 2013. My committee is very aware of those. But, you know, we had Operation Deep Dive with the Federal Railroad Administration. And since that time, we've had a real renewed commitment to our infrastructure, and that is reflected in the work that we've done. The other driver, obviously we've talked about it a little bit today, is the collective bargaining agreements, which do have some provisions for off-shift force restrictions and a handful of double time, but not a lot. And then finally, and Commissioner Brown alluded to this, we have a high vacancy rate in certain of our departments. Most notably on the M&W side, we have a high vacancy rate in the power department, 12.6% agreement, but almost 50% management, and communications and signal, where we've got a 13% agreement vacancy rate and almost 22% management vacancy rate. So in terms of our trends, year to date through March, we are actually down a bit. We're down 2.8% over the same period in 2018. We had a relatively mild winter. Hours are up slightly, 0.5%, so up just a little bit. The projects that have been driving OT in 2019 have been the work on the Upper Harlem Pole Line, some substation failures we had in the state of Connecticut, some PTC-related work west of Hudson. We've had some timing issues because we had a good winter, so we're actually able to do some track work before we expected to. And we had some damage to a duck bank out in New Haven. 2018, we were up 10% from 2017. And had 20, that's on the dollar side. We were 10.1% over 2017 at 127.8 million, and our hours were up 7.6%. The projects driving OT in 2018, we had a terrible winter. We had some windstorms that really knocked us for a loop. We had some mud spots and other infrastructure issues. Upper Harlem Pole Line, we had some collapses of the pole line. We did the undercutting on the New Haven line. This will all be familiar to the people on the Metro North Committee. PTC-related work, turnout installations, just really a whole host of infrastructure projects that drove overtime in 2018. So I'm just going to skip to timekeeping because I know the time is short. There's not been a lot of discussion of the Metro North timekeeping systems. We actually have two. Chronos, which is really throughout the system. We have 193 Chronos clocks in all Metro North facilities. We also have 90 cameras, or roughly 90 cameras at some of those Chronos clocks. Some locations actually have 2 cameras. We make sure that the cameras are functioning. These are used for all represented employees except for train and engine employees. I'll talk about them a little bit later. All employees who are in the unions are required to swipe in and out at Chronos time clocks using their employee IDs. This includes MW employees. They swipe in at headquarters locations before they actually go out to the work site. Approvals, all employees' time is improved in the Chronos system by the employee's manager or timekeeper. Overtime is calculated by Chronos based upon hours worked. They are required to be validated by a supervisor. Certain employees in the MW world actually have 2 validations. So there's a form that's got to be signed for the supervisor, then another form that's got to be signed again to validate it twice. Other departments are in the process of putting in those extra controls. My finance department also posts an overtime hotspot report as a managerial tool. We post that to the intranet. CDOT has actually retained 2 third-party contractors that monitor manning at the jobs that it pays for. We're in the process of exploring whether we can procure comparable services for projects going on in the state of New York. We've gotten a lot of support from MTA Audit over the years. We've actually requested them to come in to monitor overtime on a couple of occasions and give us recommendations, which we have followed. Based upon some work that the IG has done over the years, we installed GPS, and IG actually in real time has access to our GPS system that they can use to sort of monitor our maintenance of way employees and other employees who have vehicles. My T&E employees use a system called the crew management system. They have to sign in at a crew-based location, and then we have management approval of those assignments. We are in the process now of working with MTA IT to install biometric. We do not have it now, so we'll have to upgrade the Chronos clocks that we currently have in place. Wyle's going to speak about that a little bit to talk about what that will entail. But for us, it's a relatively easy switch out of the existing Chronos clocks to put in a new clock. We are going to need to install some sort of biometric capability at the crew reporting locations because we don't have Chronos for our T&E crews now. It's a different kind of workforce. So we'll be putting that in. We were, sort of before this all broke, in the process of upgrading our CMS system. We're going to do that anyway, and we'll obviously reflect whatever comes out of these reviews in terms of the spec for our CMS system. So that's all I have if you have any questions.
Thank you, Kathy. Questions for Kathy?
Yeah. Can you guys explain to me why you put out these 55-hour weekend work schedules when no human being can physically work 55 straight hours on a weekend? And that means they're getting paid overtime and hanging around when the contractor needs them. So why aren't we coming up with a different system, a different plan, or hiring more people and doing double shifts? Because I just got to tell you, from optically, as a taxpaying public person, putting out a bid that someone can voluntarily pick that says you're going to get 55 straight hours of overtime, I don't care if it's Friday night through Sunday night.
Yep.
Makes no physical sense. I don't know how this, benefits a worker, let alone benefit anyone. And it doesn't make any sense to me. So can you explain?
Sure.
Why you're doing it and paying, I don't even know after 16 hours under the contract whether you pay double time.
So not many of my employees get double time, so double time is not so much an issue for Metro North. The IBEW gets it, machinists get it, there's a couple of other unions that get it, but that's not a huge issue. So I would say a couple of things. Number one, sort of picking up on what Norman said a little while ago, I would love to hire more people because I really do think that to work safely, we need to have a bigger workforce on those areas to be able to perform the projects and perform them safely. We have been lobbying the FRA for years to try to put in the kind of fatigue restriction that Pat referenced at the top of his remarks. So we are very much in favor and have been looking to try to have FRA act on hours of service for maintenance of way employees. The other thing that I would like to do is have a shout out to Chris Silvera, who's in the audience here, who represents the Teamsters. Chris has been an excellent partner for us over the years in terms of negotiating work rule changes, both for fatigue management purposes, but also for overtime reduction purposes that allow more work to get done more efficiently on nights and weekends. There's a lot of work, so his members are getting a lot of work, but he's been an excellent partner to us in terms of trying to bring overtime down and also try to get fatigue under control, because I hear you. I'm very concerned about fatigue of that workforce. There's safety implications, and it's something that we need to tackle as an organization.
Pat, is there any reason why you can't, maybe you have to negotiate with the unions, which is fine, why we're not implementing an hours of service culture and system in place right away?
So Larry, there's two answers to that question. The federal government regulates in certain areas. As I mentioned in my remarks that followed yours, there are certain areas they don't regulate. The collective bargaining agreement with the Long Island Railroad, and I believe Metro North, speaks to that and does not allow us to impose limits. That would be the subject, as Norman and Vinny spoke about, of collective bargaining. And the question is, given the fatality that has occurred and injuries that have occurred around the country, and with respect to the Long Island Railroad 2 years ago on Belmont Stakes Day by the Long Island Railroad track worker foreman that I mentioned, the number of hours that he had worked that day and in the preceding several days. If we can't negotiate it through collective bargaining, I think the MTA ought to consider and be prepared to litigate agency policy limitations on that. Andy, please.
That's better. Right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. Well, in similar vein to Kathy, actually, I'd like to just kick off with a shout out to the employees of New York City Transit, of whom there are 50,000. There are 50,000 men and women out in the subway and bus system right now, and operating the three modes that we operate, including Accessoride. I think it's often a thankless task, and I would include my managers in that. It does sometimes seem thankless because they don't want to read about some of these issues in the papers any more than the board members do. And out of 50,000 people, is there the odd person potentially, maybe, working the system potentially? And if there is, then I'd like to know about that. I have no evidence to say that, because if I did, I would already be investigating that. But in 50,000, you may get the odd person. I happen to believe, actually, the vast majority of my staff are honest, decent, hardworking New Yorkers, and I go out there on the system and pretty much thank them. Equally, though, because we are so busy at the moment, do we miss things on occasions? Probably. We probably do. I probably miss things. Right now, we're run ragged, absolutely run ragged as a management team. And that is something that I've flagged to a number of people, that we cannot continue with the number of initiatives that we have right now. We will miss things. But ultimately, I agree with what Commissioner Schwartz said. I'm accountable, right? I'm the president of New York City Transit. And Commissioner, I have no problem with being held accountable. It's only a small thing, but it's why I wear a name badge, so that my customers on the trains know exactly who I am. They can challenge me for things. And on my way down to Bay Ridge today on the train, I had someone do exactly that, challenge me on why, in their opinion, the service to Astoria was so bad. So I have no problem with accountability. Ultimately, I'm here to run transit, and you should continue to hold me accountable for that. So some issues about New York City Transit. And again, to the earlier question that we were asked, we do review this this detail on a monthly basis. My management team does. We review this at high level, it has to be said, but high level nonetheless. We do so in preparation for the monthly transit committee, at which there is always a report by my CFO, and that debate carries forward to the finance committee. But just some interesting statistics, because obviously you'll want to know what's driving the overtime for New York City Transit. Well, I've had a look back through what the growth has been 2016 through 2018, and I'll come on to 2019 year to date. So the growth from 2017 to 2018 was $123 million, of which more than 3/4 was related to the Subway Action Plan. From 2016 to 17, I should have done that the other way around, sorry, 16 through 17, bearing in mind that SAP started halfway through the year, 35% was SAP. And again, 17 to 18, more than 3/4 was Subway Action Plan, because, rightly, we are doing so much work to bring the system up to a state of good repair, and the mandate certainly that I've inherited is get it done. So that's exactly what we're doing. So then we've had a look at some of the results for year to date. So up to March of 2019, year to date. At the moment, year to date overtime, this will be adjusted as the year progresses. But year to date, overtime is $33.6 million, of which SAP has accounted so far for $30.8 million, or 92% of the total. So that will correct over time. There are other factors. That's not the only one. But rightly, you hold me accountable for sorting this system out, driving up punctuality, getting the defects fixed, getting the job done. And we're doing that in association and very excellent cooperation with our partners at TWU, without whom we couldn't do this. There is very much pressure now to get the job finished. So I need some clear direction on, should I use overtime for that? Because right now we will be using overtime to finish off the SAP. But precisely because I do believe in being accountable, and precisely because I do believe in being a responsible manager, that's what you're paying for, I've made clear to my team that there should be 3 rules or 3 criteria applied to the SAP. They should be: number 1, what is the best dollar use for the work? In other words, what will give the best customer benefit, because it's not my money, it's taxpayers' dollars. What will deliver the greatest customer benefit? That's what we should be spending the money on. Number 2, what is the opportunity cost of doing that work? You can't do everything. So again, let's focus our attentions on those things that add the most value. And number 3, about which I feel particularly passionate, we must also have regard for the impact on the customers while we're doing the work. Back to the overtime results. We do have breakdowns. I've got granular detail on where the work has happened, where the overtime has been incurred. Largely, surprise, surprise, it's within disciplines such as maintenance of way, signals, car equipment, track workers. Why? Because that's the bulk of where Subway Action Plan work has been undertaken. Weather has been a factor. Weather overtime actuals 2017, 22 million. Weather overtime's actuals 2018, 39 million. And this is another area that I'm going to review. We do put a lot of people on standby for and on overtime, just in case. We have a pretty risk-averse approach to it, because we know from bitter experience that if we don't staff up, even if a storm proves to be less severe than the forecasters predicted, we get castigated. And that's then another bad news story. So we tend to err on the side of caution. I think we can probably take a little bit more risk. I've got a list here of who earns what. That's something that my management team and I will be reviewing. I thought I might jump, though, to other items that we've reviewed. We maintain a very active review of audits and investigations, things that, whether they be from the Auditor General, sorry, the Investigator General. So we're going to review the various outputs of those audits to make sure that we are compliant, to make sure that we have complied with the recommendations. We've also reviewed the various internal investigations that happen. Transit has an internal investigations department, and they investigate where there are allegations that people have been undertaking fraudulent behavior. Although, you know what? I'm looking at what that has found, and invariably we properly investigate, and quite often there is no evidence found. So then, to close, I thought I might just comment on the systems that we have, and then close with just a comment about waivers. So there are, as Commissioner Samuelson said, there are actually systems in every transit location. Some are better than others. There's no question. There's no sugarcoating that. There are three primary systems. There's one called the UTS, which is the Unified Timekeeping System. There's the Automated Timekeeping System. And there's Kronos, which is used in this building, among others. I myself sign in and out every day. There are various vintages: UTS 1995 for bus, 2006 for RTO, automated timekeeping 1987, Kronos 1990. And some are more sophisticated than others. As Commissioner Schwartz himself said, in some cases there's punch cards, there's paper timesheets, there's overtime approval forms, visual checks, particularly for people booking on to do safety critical work, there's radio call-ins. But bear in mind, a lot of what we do is people out in the system, so therefore what I would call remote booking on is the norm. I've seen it done in practically every property I have worked in. But I think it would help if we unified those systems, and if they were consistent, such that we could have more confidence in what was going on out there, and also it makes it easier to review their effectiveness. A critical point that I would like to make is that we do, for transit employees, New York City transit employees, we do have what are called monetary income caps. And for bus, there is a cap, it's 156,000. For subway, it's 168,000. But, and I said I would mention waivers. There have been waivers applied. Why? Back to the subway action plan. The waivers were put into place for good reason, because we knew that we had an order to get it done. So that's what we did. The waivers were applied, albeit we have clawed them back in recent times, certainly over the last year. And in terms of how we distribute overtime, that goes through an equitable distribution system. So I would close by saying, look, at the end of the day, is transit squeaky clean? No. Is there room to improve? Absolutely. We do have a series of ideas. We brainstorm them as a team, and we are going to work our way through those, because clearly, we want to play our part in making sure that, one of the many things we're doing under Fast Forward is upgrading our processes. And making sure that our record is open to scrutiny and challenge, as we're seeing here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. Questions for Andy?
Yeah, I have some questions. You asked the question that you stated that you need clear direction, and should you continue to use overtime. If the answer to that question is that you need to stop using overtime, it's true that the subway action plan will grind to a halt. Is that true?
We rely on overtime to get a lot of the work done.
And the only way to prevent that from happening would be to do mass hiring. That's the way I understand this.
Yes, I mean, basically, overtime is an efficient use of tax dollars, because invariably the supplementary cost of overtime is less than what you would pay for the full cost of an additional employee.
Right, I understand that, but there seems to be some, like I said before, buyer's remorse. And let me ask you a question, since we're all sitting here having a conversation. Do you observe any kind of widespread fraud or abuse in New York City Transit in terms of overtime that you assign us?
If I were aware of such fraud, I would not be sitting here today saying that there was nothing going on. If I was aware that there was abuse, absolutely, I would act upon it. I have and my management team knows this. I have a concept which is guilty knowledge. If you know something, you have to act upon it. So, as I said in my opening remarks, can I say with absolute certainty that we haven't missed something? Can I say with absolute certainty that no one in 50,000 people is maybe working the system? No. But do I think fundamentally that the system is well handled? Yes, I would say I do, because if I didn't think that, then I'd have guilty knowledge.
Well, that odd person here or there would be an anomaly. At any rate, we have we're in contract negotiations right now. For anybody who doesn't know the background of all of this, the Local 100 contract expires in 5 days. And by the way, this is the type of behavior that you've engaged in that triggers strikes in the New York City subway system. And I'm not saying that as a threat. That's the truth. That's how this is how things like this spin out of control and find their way onto the railroad tracks in a very nasty way. But with that said, these are issues that should be bargained at the table. I think if you went in a room with the TWU, we'd have a contract in pretty quick time. So thanks.
Good evening. TBTA's core mission is much different than my colleagues, as my colleagues move people and we allow people to move on our facilities. That being said, being smaller facilities, we have in place the Chrono system for some time now, where our employees do come into work. They use either their ID card or put their ID number into the Chronos clock. They use biometric, and they're also under camera. And all of our facilities, you also have to swipe in, and you're seen on camera as you enter and exit the building, or you move around as you're working. So there's a lot of oversight as far as when our employees come in and come out, or come in and leave, and also as they're working throughout the day. We break down the categories in overtime as Bob broke out, and we call it SWEEP, security, weather, emergency, availability, and planned. And through this exercise, we look to see where the overtime is, and mostly it was the availability piece where somebody is out and we try to cover that spot. The planned, we're backing the capital projects. If we have a big project, we're putting a variable message sign up or fixing a gantry. We mostly do that on the overnight, not to impact traffic. So we have our core crews at night, and then we bring people in on overtime to support those core crews. Currently, we're trending down in overtime, and we trended down also last year in overtime. We continue to use our audit functions. So Chronos, by nature, has audit functions built in, where a supervisor, I think Kathy went through it, I'll just do it quickly, a supervisor approves the overtime. We actually have a central absence control unit that then takes that approval. They look at it, they wait for the end of the pay period, make sure all the entries are correct. They send it back to the manager of that facility, and then the manager does a third approval based on that time card for that employee or that location. We're very conscious with overtime. We're a conscious agency regarding overtime, where we probably have more reports than a lot of people wish they didn't have to look at every day, but we get an overtime report, a snapshot of the day prior to see by facility where the overtime is, and we kind of get a general idea how much overtime is needed day by day, and if you see a jump up, you can act on it, or you can react pretty quickly. We also get an on-premises report where we see exactly how many employees are at each of the facilities during a specific tour, and that's by different ranks. So it would be either a sergeant, a lieutenant, an officer, a maintenance personnel, administrative. Again, something jumps out at us if we see, if usually we have 15 people at a location and there's 35 for that day, hey, what's going on? It's usually something where an emergency happened, or there was a special event, or something out of the ordinary. But it's a good check to see if we're doing our day-to-day operations correctly. Also with this, just to go over what we're doing, looking at this, as the chairman said, we're looking at our overtime for the first quarter of 2019. We're looking at the top earners, and we're taking another look to make sure all our policies and procedures are followed. Utilizing our internal security department and our supervisors and managers to make sure that the roll calls are correct, to continue to make sure that the punch in and punch outs are being followed, and we'll continue to report up as we move along through this process.
Thank you, Danny. Questions for Danny? All right, good. We've got two more presentations. First is going to be by Weil Hibbery on a rapid rollout of 21st century timekeeping and attendance that he is doing in partnership with Alex Partners. And then after that, Andy Byford's going to make a brief report on new issues with Bombardier subway cars. Weil, over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. About a week ago, you asked us to take a very hard look at our existing timekeeping systems and find ways to improve internal controls that surround them. And this presentation takes us into what the look ahead is for our systems. I have prepared detailed notes on our legacy systems. They are in the appendix of the presentation. They take about half an hour to present. So what I'd like to do is include them in the record for this meeting. So the guiding principles that we're following right now is allow for greater auditability without interfering with the accurate and timely payroll processing for all employees. We process 72,000 employees' payroll, and we want to make sure that continues unabated. The second plan is to make sure that our effort to modernize the server side of these timekeeping systems continues without delay, meaning all of our Kronos implementations were slated to go into the cloud, and then after they are in the cloud, they are to be converged into one common database so that you can swipe on any clock using one platform. That will continue. MTA Bus went on the cloud recently, about 10 days ago. And we have plans to continue moving agencies into the Kronos cloud over the remainder of 2019. The third guiding principle is to avoid patchwork or avoid jerry-rigging systems together to make them work. That's very helpful to us because it creates a support nightmare to create that kind of patchwork. And finally, to work with Alex partners so that they can help us with intensive project management and provide independent validation and verification. So what we've looked at is biometric authentication when you clock in. We have Kronos in all operating agencies with the exception of ATS and UTS in New York City Transit, which have very powerful scheduling and crewing features that will take longer to convert to Kronos. But our plan is to require every employee, represented and non-represented, to authenticate with fingerprint, which is up on the side of the device. You swipe your card, it knows who you are, then you use your fingerprint as authentication, and it clocks you in, and then at the end of the day, you do the reverse and you clock out. So we already have Kronos in the agencies. We have a contract with the vendor, and we're working closely to deploy them throughout the MTA. So implementing biometric-capable clocks will replace non-biometric clocks at Long Island Railroad. That will require us to acquire 320 new devices and deploy them to the various work locations. Some work locations have no infrastructure, so we're working with our electrical contractors to make sure we have Ethernet and power pulled to those new locations. For Metro North, as Kathy mentioned, we have 197 legacy Kronos clocks. We'll replace those with ones that are capable of biometrics. For New York City Transit, including both transit and bus, we have about 1,300 locations. We need to acquire 1,300 clocks. And for employees who are on ATS and UTS, we will still require them to do biometric authentication, but we'll continue in parallel to collect time using the legacy systems as we gradually test a migration path from those two scheduling systems into a more robust platform, such as Kronos. As you heard Danny say, B&T is currently using clocks, and we are in the process of ordering 50 clocks for them so that they continue with their upgrade unabated. Headquarters is currently using PeopleSoft, and what we'd like to do is to have one common system across the MTA, is to convert headquarters to Kronos as well, so we become equal with all of the operating agencies as well. So in terms of timelines, we've planned to complete all the work for both railroads within 90 days. The devices have already been ordered for both Long Island Railroad and Metro North. We have delivery expected in about 1 week for the two railroads. New York City Transit is vast, and we have 1,300 locations. For that, we require 6 months to complete the work. From a project management point of view, we're attacking this from both angles. Alex Partners is going to be integral to the project management office. They will provide independent validation and verification, make sure we don't miss anything. They will report to the chairman and CEO independently and also keep me apprised of how we're progressing, make sure we're not missing any dates. And our IT department has a very good project management office. They will also work with the agencies to make sure everything is progressing according to plan. Phase 2 will be to look at newer technology. A lot of our employees who have mobile phones can authenticate using geofencing, so we know where they are. They can authenticate with their fingerprint. That saves us some time so that they don't have to go to a clock, or for engineers who are out in the field day in, day out, they would save time from having to go to a swipe location. That is something that we're looking at as phase 2. It will also integrate into Kronos because the app is a Kronos-based app. This completes my comments, Mr. Chairman, and I'm happy to take questions.
So before questions, let me just make 3 points. One is, while I'm going to ask you to report starting in the June meeting monthly on status. Okay, so that's one. 2 is, a number of you asked about the questions that were raised here. We've recorded them. We will come back as a management team with responses and all those. And the first question I'm going to take from the Vice Chairman.
I didn't have a question. I wanted
A comment, forgive me.
So, on my way to the earlier meeting, I'm on the bus this morning, and a neighbor looks at me and says, "Big meeting today, huh?" So, if we don't think that everybody knows we're meeting and what we're meeting about, we're deluding ourselves. That's one. 2, like many of you, I've been around government for a while, so I know the arithmetic of overtime. I didn't come here with a made-up mind. I wanted to hear everybody make their point, because everybody does have something to contribute to this conversation. But there is an arithmetic to overtime. It doesn't just happen. It's not quantum mechanics. It's really very simple. And if you tell somebody to do something for any number of very good reasons, the tracks, the third rails are icing up. We got to get them de-iced. There was a derailment. We've got to clear those tracks. We got to re-rail cars and get them out of there. Any one of a number of things. Our contracts, because we can't point the finger at anybody else but ourselves, our contracts require that those with most seniority get the overtime. That can contribute to a very obnoxious situation if it's reported that somebody is an egregious offender of whatever it is out there. But it is something that, 1, we ask for, and 2, allow in our contracts. The thing that we didn't want to talk about today is, we didn't want to raise it, is we're going to need to negotiate these things, and it's not going to be pretty. It's got to happen, because all of these things are subject to labor management agreements, all of them. And I happen to be a believer, this is coming from the guy who, when I sat for a minute in that chair, I imposed a hiring freeze. I imposed a vacancy control committee that prevented backdoor stuff, exempting, by the way, for those who say supposedly hiring freeze, that exempted completely represented titles. So nobody who was represented was involved in that. Always keeping in mind that we had to enhance safety and security and make sure that our important signaling initiatives in New York City Transit move forward. But every time we have an initiative, that requires a workforce. And if we're not expanding our workforce and training them, because they don't hit the ground running, as you know, on day one, they require some training, they require time to lean into their jobs, then we've got to do overtime. Some of that overtime works out, and it's smart and it's effective, and some of that overtime can become grotesque. Got to deal with that at the bargaining table, and that's not something that people like to talk about in polite company, but that's what we've got to do. Look, I am very, very sympathetic to the New Yorkers who read reports and say, wait a minute, I don't make that much in overtime in a whole year. There's a lot more to that story. We're partly to blame. Management is partly to blame. This board is partly to blame. And we've got to give clear guidelines to management. Sit down and negotiate contracts. Don't overlook any of these things. We've got to have a loud argument about it, but have an argument about it.
So we just did a board training, a bunch of us, in which we were instructed to focus on big policy issues and not be in the weeds of day-to-day management of this agency. So I don't know that I totally agree. I mean, obviously I think the board should be keeping an eye on this, but I look at these managers and these labor leaders, I think I want them to cut the deal. I don't know that the board's going to jump in and be in the middle of it. I feel that's sort of like what you're trying to imply, Freddie. I mean, I don't know that the board is at fault here. We get sort of handed labor agreements, we get a 5-minute briefing on them, and we're told vote up or down. We're not a part of the labor negotiations in any meaningful way. Never have been.
I have been misunderstood by you. I did not suggest for a moment that we involve ourselves in labor negotiations. If I said that, I apologize to you.
Okay, so I mean, if we're not involved in these negotiations, I don't think it's not clear to me how we shape the outcome.
Of course, I didn't say it, and what I'm saying is we direct management to do that. I said that too. I'll repeat it again for emphasis.
Yeah, I've listened to both sides, Mr. Schwartz's initiatives, the union. We must keep in mind that our riders come first. And sometimes, you can't help overtime. I'm a business person. You had 2 tragedies within a month and a half in Long Island, for the Long Island Railroad. I mean, that's a nightmare. If we didn't have overtime, no one would get to work. And how would you like your men and women not show up for an hour or 2 hours being late? You wouldn't stand for it as an employer. I think you've done a great job. I think the union, I understand. And Larry, you have many good points, and we should move forward. And I don't think we should try and beat this anymore. But again, we can't forget the job and the good job that the men and women of this agency have done. Thank you.
Yes, was Al's presentation, which was very informative, was that all in the works before the big, media blow up with the overtime stories, or was some of what's in the works triggered after the stories?
So modernizing timekeeping has been in our plans all along. We've been moving our servers to the cloud and consolidating them. That's part of our strategy. We have been under a hiring freeze for a very long time in the back office operations, so we're not moving as quickly as we would like. In terms of deploying biometrics across the entire MTA, that is brand new, that has started at the direction of the chairman. And we're accelerating as quickly as we can to get it deployed to all of the locations.
Yeah, it's been accelerated, Kevin. Obviously, Alex Partners is going to play a key role. The Alex partner who's working with Weil is a specialist on corporate timekeeping and attendance. I think he's already added significant value. And as I said, I'm going to ask Weil to report monthly to the board and to the public, starting with the June meeting, on the progress and on the fairly aggressive timeline that Weil described. Any other questions for Weil? We've got one. Byford's going to report on additional issues with Bombardier rolling stock, and then we've got 2 or 3 members of the public on public comment.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So yes, I feel I ought to update the board on an issue we were notified of last Sunday by Bombardier. The CEO of Bombardier wrote to me last Sunday to advise that they discovered a potential welding anomaly on what's called a B weld, and I'll come back to that, that was detected during inspections of the R179 subway cars under construction in Plattsburgh, New York. So those it relates to the anti-collision pillars that are either side of the windshield. So if you imagine a train, and you're looking at it head-on, there's the primary collision pillar in the middle of the windshield. There's the secondary to either side, and they protect against side impact. And what they found was that when they were checking the A weld, which is 100% inspection at the bottom of those side impact pillars, those were all fine, but they discovered a shadow on five separate posts, different units, five separate anomalies in the B weld, which isn't subject to 100% inspection. So obviously we take safety completely seriously. So we called in our independent engineering firm. It's a firm called LTK Engineering. Working with Bombardier, they very rapidly established that the anomaly that they have now analyzed, they've basically cut these pillars up, and they've done magnetic particle analysis on them and various other destructive tests. They have confirmed that this does not reduce the strength of that side collision beneath NYCT specification. So the critical question for me that I needed to have answer was, is this how serious is this issue? Do I need to pull the fleet? And the good news is, no, I do not. But I don't just take that lightly. I instructed them being Bombardier and LTK, I sought and received a written safety statement signed by professional engineers from Bombardier to that effect. So they have given me in writing with data analysis why they believe that the fleet is safe to remain in service. We also for additional assurance, sought assurance from LTK, the independent assessor. They've also given us a safety assurance statement to say that in their professional opinion, Bombardier are doing the checks correctly. So the next steps, intensive inspection regime includes further destructive testing. I'm holding daily phone conferences with Bombardier. They will continue over the weekend. And we're honing in on now the extent and severity of these defects. In other words, what I want to know is how many units are affected, and is this something that we can just live with, or do we have to go back and undertake corrective actions on these pillars? But again, the thing I'd like to leave you with is there is no safety risk. The fleet is safe to remain in service, but clearly this is very disappointing from Bombardier, and rest assured I've made it very clear to them that is my position.
Andrew.
Yes, thanks for this, Andy. So it isn't just the cars under construction in Plattsburgh, it's the entire fleet of R179s.
We don't know that for certain. I'm assuming yes. And the reason I'm assuming yes is because that if it's effectively a right side failure, it may be that I'm wrong, but I would rather assume that they are all potentially impacted than assume it's just a couple of rogue pillars that they were constructing in Seguin, Mexico and fitting to units in Plattsburgh. So Bombardier have their work cut out. I need assurance from them about what exactly now we will need to do with the existing fleet. But again, I stress that I'm satisfied that they're safe to remain in service. Otherwise, they wouldn't be.
Thank you.
Andy's approach on this has been comprehensive, thorough, and aggressive, and responsible in the public interest. Any other questions on the Bombardier issue? Good. Kate, we have public speakers?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, we have two. The first public speaker will be Jason Pinheiro, followed by Chris Silvera.
Good afternoon on this Friday afternoon. I wonder why we are here on a Friday afternoon. Instead, we could do other things, but I'm sorry to say that I'm still waiting for an answer regarding certain union that disrupted my commute from Staten Island to Brooklyn late last year. I'm still waiting for an answer. And what we're going to do regarding the homeless in our subway state, in our subway system. And I hope that those who are here from the media are listening to this, because this is totally unacceptable. And I want John Samuelson, I know that you hate me, and I don't know, but you should tour the system late nights. We're talking about 2 a.m., 3 a.m., even 4 a.m. And take the R train from Atlantic Avenue Barclays Center to Whitehall Street, hop on the Staten Island Ferry, from there to St. George, and hop on the S40. That's totally packed, and we often see fare evasion. We don't need the cops to persecute MTA workers. We need the cops to persecute those who disrupt riders' commutes. And Larry, I forgot to mention you.
Please conclude your remarks.
I hope that Larry takes the subway like I suggested to John late nights. And you can see that what you're seeing during the day is totally different during the night.
Thank you. Our second and final speaker is Chris Silvera.
Can I get an extra minute here? Good afternoon. Mr. Schwartz, Commissioner Schwartz, I don't know if you got your financial disclosure papers. I read it in the same lunatic newspaper, the New York Post, but you couldn't get that in on time. The overtime is essential if we are going to have a system that's running at 95 or 97% on time. If your kid went to school and got a 97% on his test, you would jump for joy. These workers are delivering 97% on time, 95% on time rates, day in and day out. So when you put your little cap on overtime, and there's 12 inches or 14 inches of snow out there, how do they get home? Who finishes the work? A lot of the people who are making this overtime is because sometimes other people don't want the work. They don't want to come out. So the railroad keeps going to the same people over and over and over again. So you need to edify yourself before you start casting aspersions on people. You need to know what you're talking about. Do some investigation before you start coming around acting like we are criminals. We're not criminals. Educate yourself, and then let's have an intelligent discussion before you start jumping up and saying these crazy things that you're saying. Thank you.
Thank you. That's the last public speaker. Do I have a motion to adjourn? Second? All in favor? Thank you. Thank you all.